On a cold December night in 2018, Good Samaritan Jacquelyn Smith reached out of the window of her car to give a young woman in need and her baby $10 for food. It was the last good deed that Jacquelyn ever performed because in the next instant, she was stabbed to death and robbed. But there's something about the story that doesn't quite add up, and it's not long before the disturbing and gruesome truth comes out, leaving Baltimore reeling. Hello and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I am your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love, and this week I'm putting a spotlight on the case I'm calling Half-Past Murder. Jacquelyn Ann Smith was born on July 4th, 1964 in Providence, Rhode Island, one of 6 kids. Jacquelyn, affectionately known as Jackie by friends and family, was known to be giving, independent, intelligent, and funny. She attended and excelled at Classical High School, considered one of the most prestigious high schools in the city of Providence. After graduating, Jacquelyn attended North Carolina A&T State University in Greensboro, majoring in engineering and completing her degree in 1987. As a student at North Carolina A&T, Jacquelyn met the man who would become her first husband. The couple would have 2 sons together, Kendall and David, and the family spent years hopscotching around the country, even hopping across the pond to Germany for her husband's job in the Army. Despite the constant moves, Jacquelyn thrived in her career as an engineer. Jacquelyn and her husband divorced in 2005, and she took over the suburban Aberdeen, Maryland home that the two shared. As the Baltimore Sun noted, Jacquelyn was a devoted mom who never missed a swim or track meet for her sons, all while maintaining a successful career, working as an electrical engineer for the Huntington Ingalls Industries, where she was a contractor for the Department of Defense at the Aberdeen Proving Ground U.S. Army facility. Her focus was on engineering analysis and providing support for biological and chemical labs. However, despite all of the success in her career and her dedication to her kids, Jacquelyn was still searching for Mr. Right. And in October of 2013, he quite literally danced into her life. Jacquelyn met Keith Smith, a truck driver, at the birthday party of a mutual friend, and a shy Keith had to put on his big boy pants to work up the nerve to ask her for a dance. And as he would later say, we danced our way to the altar. The couple fell hard and fast, and on Christmas Eve, a mere 3 months after they met, Keith proposed and Jacquelyn accepted. They married in July of 2014. While family members may have gotten whiplash at how fast the courtship and marriage of the new Mr. and Mrs. Smith happened, as Jacquelyn's older sister Yvonne Saab told the Baltimore Sun, quote, we trusted her judgment. She was a sensible person. But as Jacquelyn's brother-in-law Sammy Saab told the paper, quote, in retrospect, we wish we'd asked more details. And the details, it turns out, were none too pretty. A native of Baltimore, Keith Tyrone Smith was the youngest of 4 children raised in public housing by his single mother, who was a parole and probation officer. Keith said he enrolled in the U.S. Army for 3 years and was stationed, ironically, in Germany before being honorably discharged. He then went on to work for the post office and later FedEx. So far, so good. Well, the dominoes start tipping over when single father Keith lost his job with FedEx due to an excess of points on his driver's license. Coupled with some significant health setbacks, Keith is feeling pretty desperate. And so, beginning in December of 1999, Keith turns to robbing banks. To get his feet wet, so to speak, he robbed 2 banks, making off with over 30 grand. He had set his sights on a 3rd bank when a domestic dispute with the mother of his son put him on law enforcement's radar. The woman had taken out a restraining order against him for, quote, threats of violence and mental injury of a child. So by the time that Keith ventured out to rob his 3rd bank, it was just a matter of time before he was busted. When he rolled up in his gold Nissan Maxima, which had previously been identified as the getaway car from the other 2 banks he robbed, cops knew he was the guy, and they chased him. And it was during that chase that Keith crashed his car and was immediately arrested. A subsequent search of his home turned up $20,000 in cash. Keith pled guilty to robbery with a deadly weapon and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. In an effort to get out early, Keith wrote a letter to the judge touting his tutoring work with the other prisoners, his religious studies, and work with veterans. He declared in this letter, quote, "With God as my witness, I will never let any situation in my life cause me to break the law in any shape, form, or fashion and cause affliction in anyone's life ever again." In 2007, Keith was paroled. By the time Keith and Jacquelyn met 6 years later, Keith's life had done a 180. He got his commercial driver's license and was working on building a voiceover career. Probably the biggest change was his newfound devotion to religion. While in prison, Keith had obtained a Master's of Theology and had become a devoted member of the Harford County Church, eventually being handpicked by the church's pastor, Bishop Roger Tatum, to lead ministry work at the Maryland Correctional Institution in nearby Hagerstown. Keith seemed to fit in well with Jacquelyn's family, with her sister Yvonne telling the Baltimore Sun that her brother-in-law was, quote, "a personable storyteller who often dominated conversations." And it seemed that the more Keith talked, the less Jacquelyn did. Her brother, Marcel Trisvan, noted to the Baltimore Sun that with her marriage to Keith, his normally strong sister was, quote, "just a different person. She wanted to be first in line and head of the class, but slowly she took a back seat to this dude." Jacquelyn didn't share many details about her marriage with her family, but over time, Keith began to talk openly about his criminal past. And while her family was concerned, they decided to err on the side of supporting their sister's marriage, believing that Keith had turned over a new leaf. As her sister Yvonne told the Baltimore Sun, quote, "You think some people make mistakes in life, but he's gone to prison and he's rehabilitated. You don't want to be judgmental or exclusionary." While Jacquelyn's family noticed that she had become more subdued in the presence of her husband, her money was doing an awful lot of talking. Jacquelyn, who made a really good living as an engineer, had always been known to be pretty low-key in her lifestyle. No fancy cars, no over-the-top spending. However, once Keith came into the picture, it was a different story. Suddenly, Jacquelyn, who her brother Marcel told the Baltimore Sun would, quote, "drive a car until the wheels fell off," she's driving a Mercedes-Benz while her husband is tooling around town in an Audi. The couple bought a yacht, and there was even the addition of a recording studio onto their home, meant to support Keith's fledgling voiceover career. Above all, the couple seemed happy. A member of Keith and Jacquelyn's church, Lita Henson, observed to the Baltimore Sun, quote, "They always held hands. He spoke so nice to her, about her. They were always so affectionate with each other." With Jacquelyn's sister Yvonne also telling the paper about her brother-in-law, quote, "He always professed a strong love for Jacquelyn." December 1st, 2018. Saturday, 12:30 a.m. Keith and Jacquelyn and Keith's daughter, Valeria Smith, are heading home after a night out celebrating Valeria's 28th birthday at the American Legion Hall in the Madison Park neighborhood. Keith is driving. Jacquelyn is in the passenger seat, Valeria in the back seat. It was raining. The trio had been out to dinner. They'd had drinks. They'd been dancing. Everyone's happy. Everyone's feeling good. It was a great night. The family is stopped at a stop sign in the Johnston Square neighborhood in East Baltimore. Historically, this was a neighborhood that had struggled with crime, drugs, abandoned and decaying buildings, and a declining population. In other words, not exactly somewhere you wanted to be at 12:30 in the morning. Out of the rain-streaked passenger window, Jacquelyn sees a young woman in a brown coat standing on the side of the street. In one hand, she's holding what looks to be a baby wrapped in a blanket. In the other, she has a cardboard sign that reads, "Help me feed my baby. God bless." Jacquelyn, known for her generosity, reaches into her purse and rolls down her window and motions for the woman to come over. Jacquelyn holds out $10. Just as Jacquelyn pressed the money into the young woman's hand, A man in a blue hoodie appeared out of the darkness and approached Jacquelyn to thank her. In the next instant, the unthinkable happens. The man pulls out a knife and stabs Jacquelyn before snatching her purse and the necklace from around her neck before fleeing into the night with the young woman. Keith, who was driving, he got out of the car and attempted to chase the pair, but lost them. Meanwhile, Jacquelyn is bleeding in the seat from her injuries, and Keith calls 911, pleading with the operator, quote, "You've got to help me. They stabbed my wife, man." He said he was holding a towel against Jacquelyn's wounds, doing everything he could to stop the bleeding. He rushes to Johns Hopkins Hospital, where, despite frantic efforts to save her, Jacquelyn succumbs to her injuries and is pronounced dead. Jacquelyn Smith was 54 years old. Jacquelyn was stabbed 5 times in the chest and once in her right arm. Her death, which would be ruled a homicide, shocks Charm City, as Baltimore is known. The story of a kind-hearted woman doing what so many of us would do and have done touched a chord and sparked national headlines, igniting renewed fervor about the blight of the Johnston Square neighborhood and the urgent need to outlaw panhandling at every intersection in Baltimore. Jacquelyn's story was presented as a warning about violent crime in the big city. Beware of people emerging from dark shadows, their hands out. A devastated Keith called for such a law banning panhandlers in the city, declaring in several interviews, quote, "I'm from Baltimore, and the last thing I thought was he was going to take my wife's life. Now I got to live with that. Got to live with that every day." He would later make a public plea saying, quote, "The cowards that took my wife's life, I hope it was worth it, because you are going to answer to that one day. You are going to answer to it." Even the Oprah Winfrey weighed in, tweeting, quote, "This story struck my heart. I've done this 1,000 times, but will think twice before ever doing it again." Cops head to the crime scene, which is the intersection of East Chase and Valley Streets where Jacquelyn was killed, to look for evidence, any clue that will lead them to the perpetrators. The problem is, there's no crime scene. Literally. No blood evidence, no unusual fingerprints in the car, not a panhandler to be found. Police search nearby homeless shelters thinking maybe the perpetrators were hiding out or maybe someone has seen them because a couple with a baby would definitely stand out. Nothing. Investigators turn their attention to seeing if there were any surveillance cameras in the area, hoping that might yield a clue. They drove the area with Keith and Valeria, his daughter, who was in the back seat that night, looking for surveillance cameras that might have captured something. Anything. Ultimately, they looked through the footage of 30 cameras and zilch. Nada. The car wasn't on any camera, there are no panhandlers, and in fact, residents of the area said that that particular intersection wasn't really known for being a haven for panhandlers because it was kind of deserted. And also, 12:30 in the morning, I mean, that seems like pretty slim pickings, honestly. So Keith is interviewed by police a few times, and his stories just start not to add up. He said that he took his daughter home, but then she was in the car. Then it was the young woman who reached into the car and stabbed Jacquelyn, not the mystery man in the blue hoodie. The young woman was wearing a brown coat in some versions, and in other versions, she was the one wearing the blue hoodie. At this point, Keith and Valeria consented to have their cell phones searched, and this turns out to be a big mistake because, can you guess why? Well, it's because their cell phones show that they were not where they said they were on the night of the murder. Darn technology. So Keith and Valeria both told investigators that they were in East Baltimore, the intersection of Valley and Chase. But in fact, on the night of the murder, their cell phones were pinging off the towers near Druid Hill Park, which was about 10-15 minutes away from Johnston Square. Their cell phone data also showed they were consistently traveling in a different direction from where they said they were, and that they sat in that park, Druid Hill Park, for a good 12 to 16 minutes. Keith's explanation for this is that he got lost that night, and he did not want to fess up to it that he was embarrassed. Then he says that they were sitting in the park looking at pictures from the birthday celebration that night, 12:30 at night. I'm not sure what cuckoo clock Keith thought was going to believe that, but that's what he said. And Jacquelyn's family finds the whole story about the murderous panhandlers to be pretty unbelievable too. Her mother, Anna Trisbane, bluntly told CBS News, quote, "My daughter was the type of person who was cautious. If somebody came to her window at 2 o'clock in the morning in the rain, begging for money, she would tell them, no, go get a job. I'm not giving them nothing." Jacquelyn's sister, Yvonne Saab, she was a little more diplomatic and forgiving, telling the Baltimore Sun that 2 plus 2 definitely did not add up to 4 for her because, quote, his explanation of what took place that night, meaning Keith, her brother-in-law, didn't really make sense. However, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I didn't think he murdered my sister. I thought maybe he had failed to protect her. Well, cops are starting to think that there never was a murderous panhandling duo, but that indeed it was Keith who murdered Jacquelyn. And they get a huge tip that tells them they're on the right track. So on February 14th, 2018, a little over 2 months after Jacquelyn was killed, cops meet with a source who informs them that before the murder, Keith reached out to his brother Vic and asked him to kill Jacquelyn. When cops bring in Vic to ask him about this, and I have to digress for a second because apparently Keith told the cops he was hungry, so they gave him some breakfast. So anyway, after he's done with his breakfast platter, he revealed that his brother Keith had told him that Jacquelyn had told Keith she wanted a divorce. Well, that 2 plus 2 adds up to 4. At this point, cops have tapped the phones of the Smith family, and the brothers are now talking and texting in code. Keith is buying burner phones for his daughter. It's like spy games at this point. And Vic, he tips off his brother that the cops are closing in and they're going to be arresting him soon, meaning Keith. Well, Keith decides he's not going to F around and find out, so he starts burning up his tapped phone lines, trying to leave the country. Now, Keith does not have a passport, but he somehow thinks he can either go to Canada or Cuba. Then he tries the Virgin Islands, which he could do that without a passport, and then Jamaica, which he couldn't. But his ultimate goal is to cross into Mexico. And I don't know, I guess he was going to swim because, again, passport. And Keith is also attempting to get cash advances from his American Express card, but doesn't have any luck with that. Now, in the background of all of this, Keith had stripped the house that he and Jacquelyn shared, which she owned, selling everything lock, stock, and barrel, even down to the appliances. And he told Jacquelyn's family that he was moving to Florida for his truck driving job. That's nice and close to Cuba. He was also the beneficiary of his wife's $500,000 life insurance policy, and he was able to get himself appointed as executor of her estate, telling her family that the estate was worthless. I doubt that very much. Regardless, Keith is now poised to flee to Mexico with his daughter Valeria by his side. He rents a car, a silver Toyota Camry, picks up Valeria, and they head south. The pair drive over 1,700 miles, landing in Combs, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley, a little town of not quite 3,000 people that's basically a way station for trucks. The border is 20 minutes away. So close. Practically spitting distance. First, they need to stop for gas. And it's at this gas station that a Texas state trooper who's been alerted by Baltimore PD that Keith and Valeria are on the run sees this silver Toyota Camry with out-of-state plates and a couple matching the fugitive father and daughter's description. As the Baltimore Sun reported, Keith filled up the tank, drove out of the station in the direction of the border, the trooper following suit, who flashed his lights, riding alongside the Camry until it stopped. The trooper pulled out his weapon and ordered Keith out of the car. The trooper informed Keith there was an active warrant for his arrest out of Baltimore before asking him, "Where are you going?" And Keith's response, "Me and my daughter are just out sightseeing, just riding, like they're out for a Sunday drive, like, just hanging out. We've got no agenda here." Well, Keith comes out of the car, hands in the air, and complies when this trooper told him to lie face down on the ground. A barefoot Valeria emerges from the car, a shower cap covering her bleached blonde hair. She joins her father on the ground until backup arrives. Father and daughter are taken into custody and held without bond before eventually being extradited back to Baltimore, where they are charged with first-degree murder, assault in the second degree, and use of a deadly weapon with intent to injure. Keith's trial begins in December of 2021, and his daughter and partner in crime, Valeria, testifies against her father as part of a plea deal. And the details of what actually happened that rainy night of December 2018 shock and horrify everyone. So according to Valeria, she was sitting in the backseat of the car as her father pounced on Jacquelyn, who had dozed off in the passenger seat, stabbing her multiple times. Valeria testified, quote, "He stabbed her. I saw blood on his hands. He went into the woods with the knife in his hands. When he came back out, he didn't have the knife." Valeria testified that when her father emerged from the woods, he said they would blame it on a panhandler, and that he repeatedly coached her on what to say to the cops and in the multiple tearful media interviews that they both gave. As the Baltimore Sun reported, Valeria testified, quote, "The story was supposed to be it was a homeless person or two homeless people that had a baby, and Mrs. Jacquelyn was supposed to feel sorry for them. When she gave them the money, they stabbed her." She said that when Keith got back in the car, he put a towel over Jacquelyn's head and drove east to Johnston Square as he called 911. According to Valeria, right before calling 911, her father was calm, nonchalant, and it wasn't until the 911 operator got on the line did he turn on the waterworks. Valeria says that to give validity to the panhandler story, her father instructed her to toss Jacquelyn's wallet down a storm drain, and she complied. She reveals that the motive for the murder was Jacquelyn's fat insurance policy, which was $500,000. Also remember, Keith told his brother Vic that Jacquelyn wanted a divorce, which means no more 50-foot yacht, no more Audi, no more beautiful home, no more lavish lifestyle being funded by his wife. I mean, he might have to go back to robbing banks, right? I mean, being married is way easier than robbing a bank, right? Right? Who wants to give that up? In a letter to the judge in her case, Valeria, who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, wrote that, quote, "I was strung out on drugs and scared for my life. My father made me leave the state." For her part, in her stepmother's murder, Valeria was sentenced to 10 years in prison with 5 years suspended and 3 years of probation. Keith received life, which was the maximum sentence, plus 3 years for a deadly weapon with intent to injure. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, and show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter to be notified about new episodes. You can also find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus material and other fun stuff. Learn more about my suspense novels about the dark side of love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.